Right. I'm Shannon Dill. I'm with University of Maryland Extension, and I help host the Wednesday webinars for the Women in Ag program. And we highlight a variety of topics, and really excited to introduce Dr. Sarah Hirsh. She's going to be discussing getting more results from conservation practices. So I will turn it over to Sarah. She can do her introduction and proceed into her presentation.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out today, and hello everyone watching the recording. So I work for University of Maryland Extension as an agriculture educator, and we're going to be talking about conservation and trying to select the most appropriate conservation practices, as well as how to implement and manage conservation practices, trying to get the most benefits and results as possible from conservation. Benefits in terms of economical and environmental and agronomic or farm benefits as well. So at the university, we do provide programming to everyone. And I want to start by talking about some of the goals of conservation. And I think it's important to start here because conservation is really broad, and a lot of times we may have a certain thing in mind when we think about conservation, but if we really want to take advantage the most of conservation and available resources that are out there, we really want to understand everything that's encompassed under that umbrella of conservation. And so some of the goals are to ensure better natural resource quality for you, your animals, your neighbors, other people. We want to enhance open space and wildlife habitat, improve animal health, improve soil health, prevent off-farm environmental impacts. We want to contribute to plant health and vigor, and to contribute to a more productive land. Also things like making our land more attractive, which can promote good neighbor relationships, and increasing our property value. So having conservation practices on land can actually increase the value of that land, and then promoting health and safety for our families. So all kinds of different reasons or goals behind why people choose to follow conservation practices. Next, I wanted to just go through a few of the many examples of conservation practices. So there's hundreds of different practices out there, but these are just a few of them, and I tried to select things that were kind of very different from each other to kind of emphasize the breadth of conservation that is out there. So buffer strips and pollinator strips. So, and then within each one of these, there can also be a lot of variety. So you could have riparian buffers along waterways, or you could have buffers outside of poultry house fans. So a lot of different places where there's buffers can fit and would be beneficial to the farm. Gutters and rain barrels is another popular conservation practice. Then we have things like habitat. So a lot of people will equate conservation with habitat creation or improvement. So that's one type of conservation practice. There's different practices related to animals and manure. So animal mortality disposal, manure storage structures, heavy use areas, also things like watering facilities or silvopasture. So all different practices. And these, again, are just a few of the many, many practices under that umbrella of conservation. We have practices related to pesticides, such as storage. Precision agriculture falls under that umbrella. So trying to be very efficient in how we do agriculture in our pesticide or nutrient use, or monitoring, using technology to monitor and therefore be able to be more efficient. Soil testing and nutrient management plans also fall within that umbrella of conservation. Again, helping improve our efficiency and our resource use. Organic transitioning to organic production, that is also considered a conservation practice. And these are just some of the many conservation practices that are out there. So now for a few minutes, I want to kind of switch gears and talk a bit about whole farm planning, and then we're going to go back into conservation and talk about how conservation fits within that whole farm planning, how like the interplay between whole farm planning and conservation planning. So first, whole farm planning is a really beneficial thing to do if you are a farmer or involved in agriculture. And this is a comprehensive approach to farm decision making that uses the entire farm and all of the resources into the thought process. So it's just a way for us to sit back and really think intentionally about everything involved in our farm and all of the components and how they fit together and how we can make a plan to best operate that enterprise. So the purpose is to help farmers achieve their goals. So first we have to identify our goals. What are our goals that we want to achieve? So really just thinking intentionally about all of this. So we want to help the farmers achieve their goals while at the same time enhancing natural resources and the environment and the quality of life. So kind of thinking about all of these issues and the kind of like pros and cons and how everything will interplay. And then developing a whole farm plan consists of assessing the resources, writing a plan with specific goals and measurable goals. We want to develop monitoring tools to measure the progress made toward the goals, and then evaluate and replan as needed. And I like to see it here, as you see this diagram on the screen, in kind of like a circular diagram where this is not a beginning and an end. So we are always affected by external and internal factors that's going to affect our operation, and it may change our goals. So this is kind of the cyclical process of setting a goal, monitoring that goal. So we want the goals to be really measurable and doable. We evaluate and replan, and then we assess our resources again, and maybe those resources have changed. Maybe we've acquired land or acquired equipment or acquired labor. So then we may have a new goal to set. So that's kind of what's involved in the whole farm planning. And now I'm going to talk about how conservation can fit into that idea of whole farm planning. So with conservation, a couple important questions we could start by asking would be, do you have a problem that you want to fix on your farm? So think about any issues or problems on your farm. And then also, do you have something on your property that can be enhanced? So maybe it's not a problem, but maybe it's an improvement that we could make in a certain area. Usually there's something that we would like to see improved or enhanced having to do with that operation. So getting started with our conservation planning, and just keep in the back of your mind that this conservation plan is going to be part of our whole farm plan. It's going to be incorporated into our whole farm and enterprise plan. But we can ask, what are the natural resources on my farm? And which conservation practices make sense for our farm? So some of them wouldn't apply, but there's other ones that would apply. And State and federal websites have nice lists of different conservation practices. Like I said, there's hundreds of them, but just scrolling through those lists and seeing the types of things that are out there could give you ideas about practices that you maybe hadn't thought of. But some of the questions about which practices may make sense for a particular farm would be, have you already minimized runoff? And what types of wildlife do you want to encourage on the land? Are you already rotating crops to reduce disease and pest problems? If not, maybe that would be a good practice to start. Can I improve my management of forest resources? So maybe you don't have forest and that question wouldn't apply to you. And then what crops do I plan to grow? So the types of conservation practices may be dependent on the types of cash crops that you plan to grow. And then another broader question. So we want to know about what natural resources, what practices would make sense, and then finally, how do we implement those practices on the farm? Next, I want to talk specifically because there's a specific type of conservation plan. So you could just do planning in the general sense on your own about conservation, but there's a particular service that's offered by the Natural Resource Conservation Service called a conservation plan. And that's actually an output that this federal agency, it's a branch of the United States Department of Agriculture. So the NRCS will write a conservation plan. It's a tool to help you manage the natural resources on your farm, and they can help with identifying conservation objectives and assessing and analyzing the natural resource issues on the land related to soil, water, animals, plants, air, energy, and human interaction. So again, really broad. A lot of different practices fall within that scope. There is a website on the NRCS webpage about conservation planning. So that will give you a lot more details if you're interested. And Shannon will send the slides out after today. Having a NRCS conservation plan is required if you're participating in certain programs offered by government agencies. So if you're enrolled and getting payments from certain programs, you will be required to have this plan. But otherwise, it's voluntary, and you can get it even if you're not interested in applying for financial payments. You can still request and have a conservation plan, have somebody come out, assess your land, and write that conservation plan, even if you're not interested in getting federal funding. And the best part is that it's free. So it's a really great resource provided by the government that's for free. So the NRCS conservation plan will include management practices. There's also, you may be familiar with conservation practices or best management practices. Sometimes people call them BMPs. Those all just mean the same thing. Those are your practices. Things like cover cropping or rain barrels or precision agriculture, all of those types of practices that I mentioned in the beginning. And then the plan will also include a timeline for implementing the practices, and then it'll include some aerial farm maps as well as maps of the soils on your farm. And so those are really good resources and helpful things to look at. So what to expect? You can contact your local soil conservation district or NRCS office. A technician will come out and visit your farm. They'll collect information about the crops grown, conservation concerns, soil erosion, no gutters on the barn roof, bare pasture. They're not going to be like assessing you and fining you if they see problems or something like that. It's just observations, your concerns, things that they may see, and then your input. What are you interested in adding conservation wise, or what would you like to do on your land? And then the technician will write your plan and review it with you. It goes to the Soil Conservation District Board for approval, and then the practices are installed and maintained according to the plan. It can involve practices that you could then sign up for programs and get paid some cost share to help install those practices. So it is, you are able to apply for programs once you have that conservation plan, but you don't have to. So here's an example of what it might look like. They includes things on your crop rotation. This farmer was going to do a cover crop as well. They had a diversion practice, so they were going to construct a channel across the slope with an embankment on the lower side to divert water from its natural flow. So these are just some of the things that applied for this farmer on his or her land. And conservation crop rotation was another practice that was recommended. Nutrient management, brush management. So all things that the technician and the farmer discussed and thought would be beneficial for that particular piece of land. Here's what their map looked like. This was provided from the FSA, the Farm Service Agency. And then the soil map. And so the soil is indicating the different soil series, which helps tell you about the properties of that soil, and then how those properties, that's relevant because those properties will affect the production on that land. So that's kind of an overview of how we can learn about and select conservation practices that may be appropriate to our operation. And then also just really important is for you to know that there's resources that can help you assess and select appropriate conservation practices. So they may be able to inform you of practices that you hadn't thought of or you didn't realize would be a good fit for your operation. But then even getting more specific, once we kind of narrow down what practices we want to do, there's still ways to tailor those conservation practices so that we can implement them and manage them to have the most benefits or to really achieve our goals. And the example that I'm going to use is cover cropping, and how can we really tailor cover cropping and manage it appropriately so that we can get the most possible benefits out of that cover crop. So I'll start by saying that a cover crop is a crop that's grown for a primary reason other than to harvest. So primarily that cover crop is grown for another reason, often to minimize erosion and runoff. Some people will grow a cover crop to kind of provide a mulch that competes with weeds. Maybe they want to provide pollinator habitat or alleviate compaction. So there's all different reasons to plant a cover crop, but it's a crop that's grown on the land that your primary reason is not to harvest, as a cash crop would be, the primary reason would be to harvest. And cover crops can look very different. So the question I like to ask is, are we getting the most benefits out of a cover crop? So these images here show two different cover crops on Maryland farms. And you can see that the cover crop on the right is really going to be much more beneficial for the environment and for that farm system than the cover crop on the left. And so how can we tailor our conservation practices to really get the most benefits we can out of them? And for cover cropping, we can think about really planning the cover crop the same way that we would plan a cash crop that we're growing for harvest. we really want to be intentional in planning our cover crop. And some of the components that are important is, first of all, thinking about what is the purpose of that cover crop. So I just mentioned that people could grow cover crops for different reasons, whether that be erosion control or preventing nitrate leaching. And do we want to prevent that leaching in the fall or in the spring? So oftentimes the cover crops will be grown from the fall through the spring. And so thinking about when do we want to prevent that leaching? Do we want the cover crop, is our primary purpose just to build organic matter or nitrogen? So like a legume cover crop would fix atmospheric nitrogen, add nitrogen to that soil. Is that our primary purpose? And then how does the cover crop fit within the cash crop rotation? So we have to be really conscious of that, because a lot of times the ideal cover crop that we want to meet whatever purpose we have in mind will not fit well within the window that we have. So then we either have to think about shifting our cover crop, which may mean that it's not going to achieve the goal we want, or we could shift our cash crops. So just thinking intentionally about that. And then finally, the farmer expectations. We want to really be well informed about what we should expect out of that cover crop. So we do want to be innovative and try new things, but we don't want to just throw things at the wall. We want to make sure that we're being calculated in our risk taking and realistic in our expectations. And that means also considering things like resources, capacity, equipment. I'll talk in a bit, but a really important thing is we get a cover crop out there. Do you have the resources and the capacity and the equipment to kill that cover crop when you want it dead? If not, that cover crop is now a weed in our next cash crop. So things like that, just being realistic. So this is getting more in depth into that idea of the cover crop window. So I just show a few different timelines here. So if this is our cash crop rotation, we have a corn crop followed by a soybean crop. Ideally, for our purpose, let's say our purpose is to build organic matter and to build some nitrogen ahead of our corn crop. So if that's our case and we're in this alternate rotation, corn, soybean, then following the soybean crop, we would like a really robust cover crop that included some legumes and some species that are going to scavenge deep in the soil. And so so ideally we would have a cover crop like a mix of radish, triticale, which is a winter cereal, and crimson clover, which is a legume. And that would build a lot of organic matter and nitrogen, which would then be available for the following corn crop. The problem is, in the mid-Atlantic, where I am located, the soybeans are harvested too late to really get that cover crop to establish well. And so we kind of have this sticking point, which is indicated by the red bar. So ideally, this cover crop would be planted in early September, but that's not possible within our current rotation. So then we have to think about, how do we want to pivot? Do we want to try to interseed that cover crop while the soybeans are still in the field? That may be an option, but it can have drawbacks, like maybe the cover crop won't establish well. Do we want to shift our cash crop rotation? And so that's what's shown in the next timeline down. So if we, instead of growing corn, soybean, grow corn, soybean, the corn is harvested earlier. That opens up that cover crop window where we can get the robust mixed cover crop that we want, that will serve our purpose ahead of a corn crop. So just thinking in those terms intentionally about our conservation and how it fits into our cash crop system. Other considerations with a cover crop would be, what seasonal niche do we want? When are we planting the cover crop? So most common in the mid-Atlantic is planting a cover crop. You grow your cash crop in the summer, especially for grain farmers, and then you plant your cover crop in the fall, and then that overwinters, and we terminate it in the following spring ahead of our next cash crop. And so that would be kind of this fall to spring niche, seasonal niche. But then we want to think about what functional groups of the plant species. So functional groups meaning like grasses, brassicas or forbs, or legumes. And so if I'm an organic farmer, I may be really focused on those legumes because they're a primary source of nitrogen for my operation. If I'm a soybean farmer and I grow continuous soybean and I have a lot of issues with maybe herbicide resistant weeds, and I'm just really focused on getting a nice mulch from my cover crop, you could just go with the grasses. In a lot of cases, it's good to kind of go with the default of a mixed cover crop species. So you may mix a grass, a brassica, and a legume, or a grass and a legume together and get a couple benefits there. And then selecting the specific species within that functional group. So which, if we look at the grasses, this graph is showing that you're able to plug in your first freeze date, and then it's showing that if you're planting that cover crop later, rye is going to be better able to grow and more effective than a oat cover crop. So this is kind of showing which species are appropriate with your planting dates. This tool is available for free if you follow this website here. Again, you'll get the slides and you can get that link. And you just select your seasonal niche along the bottom on the different tabs, enter in your average first freeze date, and it'll populate with the appropriate planting dates for different types of cover crops. On that same website, there's a link to a spreadsheet that can help you figure out the appropriate seeding rate. And so the cover crop that you get will also depend on the seeding rate. If you follow the fraction of base rate method, you want to go a bit lighter on the grasses if you have a mixed species, and a bit heavier on the legumes, because the legumes tend to be less competitive. So taking into considerations like that, so really you want to make sure you want to plant a cover crop, but how are we going to plant the best possible cover crop to achieve our goals, to achieve our conservation goals? Other things to consider, and this really gets back at this idea here of farmer expectations. We want to be realistic and make sure we're considering everything that we should up front. So how are we going to plant? What equipment do we have? Are we going to aerial seed? Are we going to interseed? Are we going to drill the cover crop? How are we going to terminate that cover crop? So if we don't have any means to terminate it, like if we choose not to use herbicides and we don't have a good way to terminate it, then you may want a cover crop that winter kills. This photo is showing a forage radish cover crop that will winter kill with a hard freeze, and you won't need to worry about terminating it. We want to consider how we want to either use or deal with residue. So a lot of residue could be either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your situation and whether you want that thick mulch or whether that'll interfere with what you're trying to do with the following cash crop. And then consider what financial resources are available and what programs you may want to enter into to get payments, and what are the parameters of those programs, because that can really influence the type of cover crop that you're going to want to do. If you do want to get payments, then they have certain guidelines. Other considerations are the type of operation. And so if you're conventional versus organic, production methods. You may choose different cover crops. You may have different goals for those cover crops. Like I mentioned, organic farmers tend to like to build nitrogen with their cover crops. You may have access to different equipment, and so that could be the case for organic or conventional, but especially large scale versus small scale farmers. How much acreage do you have, and what access to different equipment, and what types of equipment do you have? So for a smaller scale grower, they may be able to terminate a cover crop through tarping, just putting out a tarp on that cover crop and leaving it for a few weeks to let it die. That wouldn't be practical for a grain farmer who has 1,000 acres. They're not going to be able to use that technique. This photo here is showing an organic farmer who, of course, does not use herbicides, but they terminate it through roller crimping that cover crop. But of importance, the roller crimping has to be done right at the right timing. So that cover crop has to be in a pretty mature stage in order for the stem to break. And so again, thinking in terms of the cash crop rotation, will our cash crops allow us to wait till the necessary time that we need to wait to terminate that cover crop? So this was one example of a farmer who was trying to get more out of his cover crops. So he was really intentional. He wanted to help with compaction. He had heavier soils. He really was interested in high biomass at the spring planting. And he chose to do a wheat plus vetch cover crop. And a vetch is a legume that will fix nitrogen. And he wanted to plant it in early September. And then he was going to allow that cover crop to grow pretty late in the spring and plant green. And that means he planted the cash crop at the same time as the cover crop was terminated. And then he was enrolled in the Maryland Department of Ag cover crop program. So he had to follow certain guidelines of that program. Here's what his vetch and wheat cover crop looked like in the fall. So it was planted in early September. It did not accumulate too much biomass in the fall. So that's a pretty low amount of biomass. Typically, when we think of a really robust cover crop, we're thinking about at least 2,000 pounds per acre, and anywhere up to maybe like 10,000 or more pounds per acre. However, in the spring, it really took off because he did allow that cover crop to grow into pretty late into the spring. In the areas of his farm where he was planting soybean, he let that cover crop grow all the way to it was chest high on him. And then he crimped that cover crop with like a roller crimper. But that didn't kill it because he didn't do it at the appropriate time to kill it. His idea was to just mat it down because he was not an organic farmer. So he wasn't concerned with killing it with the roller crimper. He waited another 2 weeks. It generated a lot more growth, 12 to 15 inches more growth. And then he planted his soybean and terminated that cover crop with an herbicide at the same time that he planted. So here you can see it was a really nice stand of the cover crop. We're now up to about 8,500 pounds per acre, which is a really nice cover crop. As you can see here, there's a lot of biology in that cover crop and in the upper layers of the soil. You see an earthworm here. And then it made a really nice mat or mulch in the following underneath that following soybean crop. So this photo was taken in early August. So that's going to help with a lot of things, building organic matter, impeding weeds, a lot of benefits of that cover crop there. I wanted to show some pictures in the next field over. He had the same cover crop, but that field was going into corn. So he treated that cover crop a bit differently because the corn is planted earlier than the soybean in this region, and he planted the corn into the standing cover crop in late April. The cover crop was about waist high at that point. You can see a picture here the day before he planted of what that cover crop looked like. He said the planter knocked down and matted the veg somewhat, and then he sprayed with an herbicide 3 days after planting. So that's what we refer to as planting green. And he had no problems planting through that thick cover crop due to the equipment that he had. So he said that he had a planter with what he called shark teeth, and that it cut right through the mat, and he had no problem planting into it. I want to emphasize that because this gets back to our idea of really planning and being intentional about our cover crops. So this cover crop worked great for this farmer, partly due to the resources that he had and the equipment that he had. Other farmers who don't have the same type of equipment have struggled with cover crops like this because they aren't able to plant through it, and they're not able to get their cash crop grown. So really thinking about what are our resources, what are our equipment, and what is the best cover crop for our scenario, or what is the best conservation practice and management of that conservation practice considering our specific scenario. So here's what his corn crop looked like. He did say that he was worried because it was almost 16 days until the corn came up. He almost replanted it, but then he had no problems. He said he was really pleased with his corn, the stand, the yield, everything. That's what it looked like in May, June, and then August. Again, you see that nice mulch there. So finally, this is my last slide, and I just wanted to end here because when we're thinking intentionally about our conservation practices and designing them and trying to get the most out of our conservation practices, it's really important that farmer to farmer learning. What have others done and what have they found to be successful, and what are the caveats? So what have the types of things like talking to this farmer, he would have mentioned that the planter with the shark teeth was really important for him to be able to plant through that cover crop. So this is the type of information sharing that can happen when you talk to other farmers who have tried the same or similar conservation practices, and how can you learn from them and what worked and didn't work from them and kind of grow together. This picture on the right here is another kind of educational event we had where farmers like learning from each other, but this farmer was trying to grow a cover crop in a field that was going to be watermelons, and you can see the strips here. He sprayed down where he would plant the watermelons pretty early, but then he let the cover crop grow later in the aisles. And this replaced his black plastic on the operation. His primary reason for doing this was because water was splashing up off of the black plastic. We get a lot of rain here in the summer, and it was causing disease in his watermelon field. And so by eliminating the black plastic, he said he was able to conserve water. It's not running off the black plastic, but also reduce that splashing onto the leaves of his watermelon, reduce the disease pressure that he was facing, and then he just eventually rolled that cover crop down in the aisles and terminated it, and it served as a mulch to hold back weeds. And again, he was not organic, so he could go in through the season and spray if there were any weeds to emerge. And so this was a really good system that worked for him with his constraints and operation. Here is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. I always appreciate teaching evaluations. And yeah, if you have any ideas or interest, comments, questions, I'd be happy to hear from you. And I believe we have some time for questions if anybody has them. Check the chat here. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, I see Jennifer posted that they have a farmer that uses a helicopter to plant his cover crops. Yep. And timing is the main reason. Yep, we have similar things around here. We're pretty flat, and so usually they'll use the airplane, but I've heard in other regions where they have hillier land that they do use the helicopters, and that's can be a good option to interseed into a standing cash crop and get the cover crop planted early enough to really meet more benefits. Any other questions that anybody or comments? Okay, let's see, with organic type farming,